look here. I have my own journal. I used this setup for the past 5 or 6 years, and it's just the three things that are important to me. Not the to-do list, but what really matters, something that you're grateful for, something that you're proud of, something that you dream of, and something that you pray for. Something simple but effective. And you can find it at lifewithfrancie.com. The link will be in the description of the episode. Hello, welcome to Life with Francie podcast, a place where you will find all kinds of conversation like mental health, self-love, self-care, trauma, hobbies, and more. With this podcast, I want to create a place where we support one another in business and personal life. Hope you enjoy this episode. Now, let's get the show started. On today's episode, I have the pleasure to talk to Jaclyn, and I met her. I don't know if I pronounce it right, but we'll talk about it in a
You
minute.
did. You
Okay,
did.
good. I found her through Women in Podcasting, an amazing community for podcast hosts and podcast guests to make amazing collaborations like this one, which we did. And I just did her podcast, Dooms to Bloom podcast, and now she's coming on mine. So by the time my interview is live, her interview is already gone. So go check it out, Dooms to Bloom podcast. Uh, Welcome to the show. Tell us, what is life with Jaclyn?
Well, first, I wanted to thank you, Francie, for letting me be a guest. I haven't been a guest very often, so bear with me. But I just wanted to thank you for just the platform and the opportunity. And life with me is chaotic, chaotic, crazy, and busy, but all in the best of ways. I guess I can start with my kind of Monday to Friday job. This is Stella, by the way. So my Monday to Friday, I work in social services. I work with a very vulnerable population, so it's the unhoused population. And maybe I should note that I'm in Canada, so I don't know if that makes any difference for kind of the population, but I would imagine they're relatively the same. And so my Monday to Friday, I work with the unhoused individuals. Obviously, the main goal is to get them housing, which is very difficult with the market the way it is right now. And after working through obtaining housing, I assist them with maintaining it. So that looks like working through mental health struggles, working with addiction, working with legal involvement, court support, food insecurity, all of those kind of things. And so that's kind of my main focus. And out of all of that, with the struggles in today's society, I often say that the world is a big scary place in some ways, just with the wars and the fighting and the violence and housing crisis and the drug crisis and all of those. I think it's a relatively scary place and a scary time right now. And so seeing the world the way it was back in 2022, I decided the only way that we're going to be able to have these conversations and learn more about things and teach others and educate and break down stigmas of all kinds of topics is to simply talk about it. And so I decided to create a podcast just like you, Francie. And so my podcast is all about mental health, addiction, and trauma. And I welcome anybody and everybody to listen and to join in and to guest. But essentially, my big goal is to raise awareness of trauma, addiction, and mental health. And those three look different for everybody, which is a big part of why I wanted to do that. And the other part of the podcast is to break down the stigma. Obviously, the stigma has been around for so freaking long that it's not just going to be a one and done and gone with, which I would love if that was the case, but that's not how it's going to work. And so just continually having these conversations, I share my struggles of mental health and my past trauma as well, and my experiences nowadays with medication, with therapy, with different healing modalities, with support and all of the like, partnered with my guests sharing their experiences as well. Some of the guests, which I find kind of fascinating, they range in, I guess, what their lives look like. So when I say that, I mean, some of them range from personal trainers talking about how important movement is and activity is for those in recovery and those struggling with mental health. I've had dietitians talking about more of the food aspect and healthy eating and how that contributes to a healthier lifestyle. I've also had individuals that have struggled with homelessness or incarceration or institutionalization, and how they've came out on the other side, and now they are supporting others similar to what I do in my day-to-day life. And just a wide range of topics talked about and so many different experiences. And so that's just a bit of a snippet into my life.
Okay, and I love that. I love your heart. I knew that you're something special. Um, so what's your story? Did you start your mission because of your job and you're seeing what the world is out there, or had something happen in your life to give you empathy and, caring about other people's struggles?
So both, but do you want the long story or the short story?
I'm here for it. Whatever you want to
Okay.
share.
So I guess I can give kind of the longer rundown version. I think the in the bigger picture, it makes sense for me to share my story because then others relate, but
Mhm.
also that's the big why, so that others don't feel so alone like I did. So I can start back when I was in, I think it's grade 1 when you're 5 years old. And so as far back as I can remember, I've always felt different. I always, wondered and worried, if I wear this shirt, if I wear these shoes, if I say this in class, if I do this, if I say this, whatever the case is, am I going to be judged? Are they going to think I'm stupid? Are they going to look down on me? Like all of these kind of thoughts as early as 5. And now being an adult in the mental health realm, I can see that being anxiety, 20 plus years ago. But never once when I was 5 did I realize that was a thing. I thought that was just, me being normal or sorry, me not being normal. And that's why I didn't want to talk about it. So I went through all of public school, so grade 1 to grade 8, feeling that way. In the summer of grade 8, going into grade 9, when, puberty is happening and life is happening and you're making this big shift, I experienced a sexual assault. And so it was actually a very close friend's family friend, if you're following that.
Yep.
And so essentially, long story short for that was, he told me that I wasn't very likable, I wasn't worthy. And so in order for me to get people to continue to like me and to want to be around me, I had to do A, B, and C.
Mhm.
And when I said, no, I don't want to do that, like I'm 13, 14 at this time, I'm like, no, I don't really want to do that. Sorry, but no, it's not happening. And so anyways, it ended up happening because kind of a play on words and manipulation, in the sense of, well, you're going to have to do this at some point when you get older. So you may as well start now and be good, so people actually like you. People actually think you're smart enough or pretty enough or thin enough or whatever it was. And so that happened. I really struggled even more so with self-worth, self-esteem, knowing who I was, how I was going to kind of get over this. Because again, that anxiety that I was experiencing that I didn't talk about was becoming more and more prominent and more frequent and more intense. And I still had that in the background, but then I had this sexual assault on top of that. And I didn't know where to go. I didn't know who to turn to. I was like, is this normal? Maybe this is just part of going into high school. I don't know.
Mhm.
And so I kept that under the rug for a long time. Then when I got into grade 9, I noticed that there was kind of like you see in the movies, where there's the popular girls and the not so popular, and I was kind of somewhere in the middle. Not that I wanted to be on either end, and it didn't matter to me at that time. But for the popular girls, they had like everything. And so they had, the cute boyfriend, the cute clothes, the parents with money, and all of that kind of stuff. And not to say I didn't have those, but it was just more amplified in their life. And so I started hearing the voice of the man who sexually assaulted me saying, you're not pretty enough, you're not thin enough, you're not smart enough, you're not all of these things. And so I did what I thought was the only way I could control my body, my life, how things were at that time. And I'm somewhere around probably 15 now. And so I turned to food, and instead of turning to binge eating or eating excessively, I started to restrict because I thought, okay, if 14-year-old me, who just not that size matters or weight matters by any means, but at that time I was probably a size 0. So I was very thin. And for him to say I wasn't thin enough, like, went through my mind, and I thought I have to do something to be likable because I have the next several decades to go. And so I started controlling my eating. I wasn't diagnosed at the time, but it was anorexia, and starved myself, over exercise. I remember being at family meals and meals with friends, just kind of pushing my food around the plate because I didn't want to eat it, because in my mind at that time, one meal meant that I was going to gain weight. And then, just like he told me, nobody was going to like me even more. So it was just the cycle going through my head of the words he said and how I could control myself at the time. I started therapy and medication for anxiety and depression at that time. So alongside all of these struggles, I finally got a formal official diagnosis from my doctor for anxiety and depression. But then I also was still struggling with eating, and I kept that very under the rug. I didn't tell the doctor. And then somehow, some way it came up, and I was forced to go to the doctor. They gave a referral to therapy and started me on medication for the anxiety and depression. Therapy for the eating disorder lasted a very long time because it was very ingrained in me at that time, of all the what ifs, and I'm not good enough and I'll never be enough. So why bother? Why try? So a lot of therapy. And then when I started to see the therapist, not because I didn't want to per se, but I felt like at that time in my life, that was the only thing I could control, was how I was eating or what I was putting in my body or how I was treating my body. And so the therapist was working to get me to eat, to minimize exercise, and just kind of let my body be how it was at the time. And so I turned to something else that I could control, which is, to me, even worse. And I started to self-harm, and I struggled with suicidal ideation. Thankfully, I never actually acted on the suicidal ideation, but I definitely did some quite intensive self-harm. I covered that up until it came out in a therapy session. And then it was this emergency situation where the therapist is like, okay, we're bringing your parents in. They're going to talk to you about this. Like, we got to do something. And so I very clearly remember both of them, and they're divorced at this time for several years, almost a decade, actually. I remember them coming in and sitting, and my mom literally just looking at me and saying, why are you doing this? This is stupid. Why would you hurt yourself? Why would you do this? Like, and the therapist and myself trying to explain, this is what I feel. This is what I feel. This is what happened. I feel numb. I want to feel something other than all this hurt and pain. To this day, I still remember her saying, this is stupid. Why are you doing this? Like, there's no benefit to it. So again, into more therapy, into heavier doses of medications, into different medications. Finally found one that kind of subsided those suicidal ideations for a while. Was in therapy for the self-harm, which was incredible, and stopped that and haven't done that since. So that's about probably 12 years ago now, which is amazing. And then I can say probably in about grade 11, so somewhere around 17 years old, I started recovery of eating disorder. And so that's about 10 or 11 years ago now. So I've also been in recovery since then. But I, with anxiety and depression, it's always a struggle. It's always something that unfortunately is going to be there, and it's the reality of my life now. But I also experienced another very traumatic incident in grade 12. So I was 17, turning 18 at this point. And I remember very distinctly, and for not providing descriptions for potential triggers or anything, I lost my best friend to a murder. Wow. I guess it could be considered probably a domestic violence situation. She knew the individual. There was some jealousy and some alcohol, and anyways, he ended up shooting her, and she died. So that happened when I was 17, and alongside, that suicidal ideation, the anxiety, the depression, the already struggles that I was experiencing, that just intensified that to the max. I had no idea what to think. I thought, growing up in a really small town of less than like 10,000 people, I thought I was safe. This happens in bigger cities or unfortunately in the States is what I was often told as a child. And this doesn't happen here. I'm fine. I'm safe. But then this happened and I kind of went into fight and freeze mode. Sorry, fight and flight mode. And I just didn't know whether I was coming or whether I was going often. I really struggled to trust people. I didn't know, maybe I was missing something about the incident. Maybe something else was happening. I don't really know, but inside me, it was like this panic alarm turned on and it just sounded every single time people were around me. And so trying to cope with that, because historically I didn't have good coping mechanisms, I started drinking. And so that didn't turn into an addiction, but probably would have had I continued to drink. And so, a little side note, I come from a family of alcoholism. And growing up, I learned I don't want to be like that. I don't want to consume that much. I don't want to end up with the screaming and the fighting matches and the assaults and all of that. So I drank quite heavily for probably 4 or 5 months after the death. And then I don't really know what switched in me, but something switched and said, you got to stop drinking. Like, this is becoming a problem. You're going to end up exactly like who you don't want to end up like. And so I stopped. I went to university and I decided I wanted to be in social services. I didn't know how. I didn't care whatever it took to get me there. But the big motivating factor for that was I had an interest in law. I went to the trial, the court dates and the trial as much as I could for my friend, and I saw some images and heard some things that will probably stay with me forever, unfortunately, but that really empowered me to try to help others hopefully not experience the same thing, but just in general. And so I went to school for social work and law, and then fast forward, those 4 years of university, I'm now where I am. But to answer your question in the very long way, I started the podcast due to personal reasons and also all of the things I experienced, and then also how I view the world professionally when I'm at work dealing with the vulnerable population that I already work with, and seeing all of those issues still continue to be, intensified, but not limited to just that population. Everybody struggles with something. And addiction and mental health and trauma aren't just for the lower income or just for a certain category or a certain age or a certain culture, a certain race. It's everybody. And so my personal experiences partnered with what I see and hear at work was really the foundation for the podcast.
Wow. Do you look back to that 17, 8-year-old self and like talk to her, or do you are more of like, oh no, she's over there and I'm over here, we're good to go?
I think it depends on the day, really, or kind of the circumstance. I definitely talk to my inner child a lot in some circumstances. So if I'm feeling like the fight or flight and I'm like ready to just run, I kind of try to channel her and say, what's going on? Like, is this from the past? Because I'm still in therapy now. I'm still on medications, although it's been multiple years off and on. But I still try to channel her and say, what can I do to support what's coming up right now? Why are these feelings coming up with whatever is coming up thought wise? And so more often than not, I'd say I'd probably channel in that younger me. And then also, to take a spin on that, though, I also try to thank her, because while she did struggle with a whole lot of things, I'm still alive. And, when I was probably at the deepest, darkest point of the anorexia, I had doctors saying, your heart's going to start shutting down, all of your organs are going to shut down because you're not feeding your body, and you haven't been for so long. They don't know what to do. They don't know how to support you because you're not allowing them food and energy to do their role. So why are they still operating? And I think that was a really big critical moment where I was like, okay, if I don't do something, if I don't eat once a day, if I don't, talk to somebody, I'm not going to be around. And I know that while I definitely struggled, my inner child to some degree saved me. And so I always try to thank her as
Mhm.
well for all of what she did. And I try to still give my body gratitude and thank my body. I recently was diagnosed with
Mm.
Crohn's disease,
Oh.
and that has been directly correlated back to the eating disorder. And so I try to give myself enough grace every day, which is harder than some days, but I try to give gratitude and grace for my body, saying, you could have shut down 10 years ago. My heart could have failed, like all of these different scenarios, but you didn't. And even on my recovery journey, my legs, even though they were super thin and super sore and fragile, you still allowed me to walk. You still, carried me day to day. So I try to give myself a lot of gratitude and grace in that way as well. Despite the struggles, my body has still been there,
Mhm.
and the inner child has still been there trying to save me.
I love that, and that's why I asked, because like for me, it's more like a 9-year-old self that acts up the most. That when I'm triggered, like I go back to her because of the safety and protection part.
Mm-hmm.
But seeing, oh my goodness, all that you struggle with, and coming out to be here today, like wow, what a miracle. And so glad that you fought for your life even in the darkest days, where you didn't even see
Mm-hmm.
a light, and then dealing with your stuff, and then having the trauma of losing your friend. I can imagine that season, how hard that had to be, and then coming up to switching all that darkness to something positive. How did you become with the name for the podcast and all the deals to have the podcast?
Well, so if I'm going to be honest with you, I literally one day decided to just do the podcast, and it was not out of the blue because I'd been thinking of it for so long, but just was one day I decided, okay, today's going to be the day that I'm going to do it, and I don't care what it looks like, I'm just going to do it. So I literally went on Canva. I made this random logo, which was horrible, and I named it the I Am Podcast
I love
because
it.
it was the first it was the first name that came to mind, and it was the first logo I saw. So I was like, okay. And then, regrettably, but being honest and open, I found this platform and program that allows you to record and edit into it. And I had never, ever done that before in my life. So I was like, okay, this one has good reviews. I'm going to buy it. We're going to go with it. It's going to be fine. It was horrible, but I started it. And so once I got a bit more traction and started learning more that this program really, really sucked and I didn't want to use it, I took a hiatus last year for probably like 7, 8 months, and really took time to learn about podcasting, learn about connecting and networking and programs and all of these kind of things. Tech is not my jam, so it's been really hard, but it's been worth it. But so then when I decided I had improved my skills enough to be able to actually host the podcast and have it flow and make sense and be a little bit or a lot maybe better than the I Am podcast, I decided, well, because I've revamped everything else, why not change the logo? Why not change the name? And so Doom to Bloom originally was going to be Doom, Gloom, and Bloom, but then it just sounded like a play on words and didn't sound right to me. So I figured Doom, which to me represents, the darkest, deepest moments in somebody's life, and going from doom to bloom, bloom being, maybe you're not your best self yet, but you're improving, you're working on yourself, you're certainly out of the darkness and you're into more of the light and just starting to thrive. So I wanted to show that there is that ability to go from the darkest times to more of a lighter, less traumatizing, less struggle in for a lot of people. And for me, for example, like the struggle started when I was 5. That's been 23 years, right? For some people, the struggles have only been 2 years or 7 years, but regardless, they went from doom to bloom. And so that's essentially how the podcast operates from. If you take a chance or have a minute to look at the logo at some point, there's a skull in the very bottom of the logo, which that also represents doom. And the skull being, essentially your mind, how all of the darkness starts in your mind, where all of the suicidal ideation or the thoughts of self-harm or depression are sunk into your mind, and you're in that space where it's hard to kind of crawl out of. And then if you look at the top of the logo, there's the flowers. The flowers represent you blooming and turning into that improved sense of self, or a better version of yourself, or a more healed version, a better thriving version. So it makes sense once you look at the logo, I think, but
Mm-hmm.
that's how I came up with the name.
I love it. And great conversations, because like I just had my conversation with you, and I love your style of interviewing the guest.
Thank you. It's not been something that I've ever really done until I started podcasting, and I absolutely hate public speaking, but for whatever reason I like this. So I'm just gonna.
It's so different because like I'm so open on my podcast, but then I don't know what to post on social media. But I'm an open book on my podcast. You can find all kinds of content on my podcast, but I will never speak as freely as I do with the podcast. It's just, I don't know what it is.
Have you ever dug deeper into the why? Is there a certain like inner child part that's scared of something or fearful? Like for me,
Family and close friends.
okay. For me, I struggle to show my face on my social media, not because I don't think it's helpful or beneficial, but more so the voice from the first sexual assault that I experienced
Mm-hmm.
still is in the back of my mind. Like, you're not thin enough, you're not good enough, you're not worthy, nobody's going to like you. So why put my face out when people like my content, when there's, the videos or the educational pieces or the inspiration pieces, or just, hey, I've uploaded another one without having my face. So that inner child part of me is still affected with that. And so maybe that's something that might affect you as well. Maybe aside from having friends and family on there. I don't know.
Yeah, no, so I can relate a little bit on that one. Mine, sadly, is my biological father's. So I had a PhD in every single type of abuse thanks to him, so I could help others. And yeah, that voice, girl, it doesn't matter the years. I haven't seen him in almost a decade, and it's still a picture or his name doesn't bring as much trigger as it did in the past, but the mental and emotional abuse,
Mm-hmm.
that is hardcore, the hardest part, because like from a bruise, yeah, nobody wants any physical abuse either, but you have that bruise and then the bruise goes away. But what they said,
Mm-hmm.
and especially like right now that I love myself, you can tell me whatever you want and I'll be like, that's a you problem. That's not a me problem. I think I'm awesome. If you don't share the same opinion, that's your problem. But before, when I didn't love myself, when didn't know my worth, that I didn't know I was enough and things like that. Yeah. One of the times that I can think of, very simple example, I come from school, a different language because I was raised in Puerto Rico. So I'm in an American school with English. All my classes were in English, and I had C's and D's. And he looks at the grades in front of the motorcycle club, that two few guys, and says, "Really? With this grades, are you aspiring to be a stripper? Because that's all you're gonna be." So that little thing right there has set me back for so long, believing in that I'm just nothing, like I don't worth anything. So yeah, I get it, and it's so hard, but the loving yourself part, having that self-awareness and working on your circle, like that helps so much, because like right now I wish I had all that I have right now in my 30s, in my 20s, because that
Mm-hmm.
would have been so helpful. But I wasn't willing to accept the help either at that time.
I think it also goes to the cliche quote of something to the effect of be kind because you never know what others are struggling with.
Mm-hmm. I go by
It's
that.
so cliche, and people are always like making fun of that and whatever, but it's true. You literally can look at somebody and, for example, the one that I hear most often with society in Canada is, look at that lady, she's very overweight. She doesn't need any more hamburgers, or maybe she ate too much. Whereas if you take a step back and think, well, what is she struggling with? Is she struggling maybe with a binge eating disorder? Maybe she has, I have no medical knowledge, but maybe she has a disorder or medical condition where she gains weight and it's out of her control. Maybe she struggles with her mental health and the medication the doctor put her on has weight gain as a side effect. I think
Mhm.
like just, that's a very simple example that I hear quite often. And I always try to, if I hear it, reframe it or try to tell the person who's saying it, like, you really don't know what's going on. And sometimes, like you mentioned, words are the ones that hurt the most.
Mhm. And you literally don't know, and anything could be trauma just because it's not your trauma. Like even me, I am guilty of diminishing my own trauma because
Mhm.
it's not like my age was late teens, early 20s. So that's nothing compared to somebody that it would have been a child. Like as you're telling your story, I will put your trauma 10 times on top of my trauma. But that's not how it goes, because it depends on the environment that you was in. And yeah, I was gonna ask you a question on that one if you feel comfortable
Sure.
answering. Your environment at home, was that the time that it was close to the divorce? Because I got, while you were mentioning the years as your fam, because I can understand about a family friend because I have a bunch of them that I have aunts and uncles that have had best friends and
Mhm.
come in and they're like family.
So I just want to clarify, you're asking if my struggle started around the time of divorce?
If it was around that time where the first attack or first abuse, I'm sorry, I don't want to trigger you if you don't want to
No,
answer.
no,
Like
no.
it's
I'm
okay.
just trying to think back to like the time. So my parents divorced when I was 5.
Okay.
Um, so I guess maybe in theory, yes. Like that's when I noticed what I now know as anxiety back then was really ramped up for a child. Um, and then kind of in the background, my mom had divorced my biological father. There was some domestic violence going on there, some incarceration. I
Okay.
don't really remember for timeline wise or how long, but then my mom remarried somebody that I absolutely despised.
Oh
um,
no.
and
Yeah.
so I would say it definitely probably started with the divorce. Not that I was probably conscious of it at that age, but
Yeah.
looking back, definitely,
It was
definitely.
just it was more of the point of the parenting and
Hmm.
the environment that your parents had, but now it makes sense as your parents were dealing with their own stuff to
There
not
was
be as present.
totally, there was also like the divorce was, I mean, from what I can remember, because I was really young at the time, but from what I can remember, it was very messy.
Hmm.
They, what I remember is they've only been in the same room or same space in the 23 years that they've been divorced. I can count on one hand. And so the first one that I remember is my brother's wedding last year. I can remember my graduation from university back in 2018, I believe it was. And I know there was a couple other, but aside from that, they have not communicated except for lawyers' papers, which obviously it's all dealt with now because it's been
Yeah.
so long,
Yeah.
but they never communicated, by phone or by texting, or when one was picking up and one was dropping off. It was never very civil. I remember going to my dad's house and he would say all kinds of nasty things about my mom. And then when I was at my mom's, she and her new husband at the time would say the same, different things, but same type
Yeah.
of stuff about my dad. So it was always like I was supposed to be picking sides, but I never knew enough to know to pick sides. And all I really wanted was just to be loved by both of them.
Hmm.
And yeah, I just like, there's definitely certain conversations that I remember my mom saying and certain ones that I remember my dad saying about the other. And
Yeah.
that really played games with my mind, I guess, because I didn't know what was happening. And, my mom would say, oh, well, he's in jail right now, or, oh, this happened. And I didn't know who to trust. So I didn't know whether it was true or if it was just her trying to pin me against him. Like there was so much unhealthiness to that whole
Yeah.
divorce that, yeah. And for probably up until I was about 16 or so, I went every other weekend to my dad's.
Mm.
And so it was like those 2 days of hearing all of this negative, bad stuff about my mom, going back to my mom for, 4 or 5 days of the week, and then hearing everything she had to say about my dad, and then trying to just suppress that and not think about it when I went back to my dad's. But then as soon as I saw my dad, all I could think of was, oh, mom said this, this, and this. And then when I went back to my mom's, it was, oh, dad said this, this, and this about you. And it was chaotic and
Yeah.
definitely not a great environment.
Yeah. And
And
do you have,
unfortunately,
yeah, go ahead.
oh, I was just going to say, unfortunately, I think divorce happens like that a lot.
Oh, yeah.
Definitely
It's
more messy than
very
it is
rare.
not.
There are some cases that they're able to leave and either have a good communication or become friends, but for the most part, it's very chaotic. And on my part, my parents got divorced when I was one. So, and pretty much he divorced her, so he divorced me too. And
Mhm,
then my mom moved back to Puerto Rico, met my dad, who I call my dad, and it was a different experience because she's been married with him for 34, 35 years now. And that's my dad, and he was able to give me an example of how a woman should be treated and loved and protected. Then 9 years old, biological father comes in and it's like, nope, that's too good. Then this
mhm,
needs to be crushed, and crush that little box that my mom had. And that's when I became angry and all that stuff. And I just didn't understand, especially after I had my brother, as to why he fought for him, but he didn't fight for me. But
mhm,
now, as an adult, I can be grateful. My mom now is my best friend, and we have a great relationship. And then I'm dead to my biological father and my half brother. But I can be grateful of only having them for 7 years of my life and having more of positive things to
mhm.
that. Now the light was able to overtake all that darkness that he introduced to my life. But I was just random question just to see the kids and the parenting, because usually abuse and all of that stuff that are really hardcore is having parents that are not emotionally intelligent and parents that are not present, because
Mhm.
that's where I say my mom is almost perfect, but that almost is in caps. And it's
Mhm.
just because she wasn't present as I was growing up. But I'm glad that you're here. And do you have
I'm
kids of
here.
your own?
So, not biologically, I am dating somebody for, I think it's about 2.5 years now. He has a daughter himself from his previous relationship. So, when I met her, she was 3 and she's going to be 6 in February.
Oh, nice.
So, not biologically, not yet, but hopefully
Yeah.
one
Oh,
day.
yes. Yes. That's right. I say I'm too young. And the last guy, oh my God, I'm a mail lady during the day. And one of my customers, I call them grandpa or grandma. And one of my grandpas on my route, I tell him, he's like, oh, so do you have kids of your own? And I was like, no, I'm too young yet. He busted out laughing like a giggle, a laugh that came from his stomach. I was like, okay, Mr. Brooks, you did not have to laugh that hard. It's not that funny that I keep saying that I'm still too young.
But you got to have fun with it, right?
Right? So, is there anything else that you would like my listeners to know about you?
I think just if you are or ever have struggled with mental health or trauma experiences or addiction, either personally or you have loved ones or friends or family that have, I think it's just important to know that you're not alone. And I think for me, the biggest part of my story was reaching out for help when I was
Mhm.
ready. It's hard, it's really hard. but it will be worth it to reach out whenever you're ready. And I think if you're still feeling alone or you're still struggling, I would be more than happy for you to take a listen to the podcast. And maybe there's something on there with somebody's story or a quote somebody says or a question somebody asks that resonates with you. I would be honored to be able to provide you that sense of community and platform where you hopefully don't feel as alone.
Where can my listeners find you?
So I am on all major platforms for podcasts. So Apple, Google, Spotify, all of the other ones. I'm just Doomed to Bloom podcast. It should pop up right away. I am also on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook, Doomed to Bloom podcast. Just the name, pretty simple. And I am a little bit maybe of a sneak peek if I can. I am looking to create a email chain so I can send out some things. I'm going to leave
Heck
that as a surprise.
Yeah.
But I am looking into making an email, and I'm also looking to start up a YouTube channel as well. So you can be ready for those at some point.
Awesome. Can't wait. Anyways, thank you so much for coming on my show, doing this collaboration between the two podcasts. And it was a blast talking to you for the past 2 hours.
Absolutely. And thank you again for guesting for myself and also for allowing me to guest. Like I said, I haven't really been a guest very often. So I know when other people are a guest for me, there's that healing component to sharing their story. And I never really understood it because I've never really shared my story, especially as a guest. And so now I can understand how that is. So thank you for that opportunity as well.
Yes, you have a powerful story. You need to share it more often, please. And it's a way
I'll
too
work
for
on
your
that.
listeners to relate to you. You know, to know that that for real what you're talking about. But when you get comfortable, hey, I have over 200 episodes, so I have done over 100 interviews, but I have done like 10 podcast guest appearance. So the ratio is very different as well for podcast guesting.
So when you start practicing what you're preaching to me, I will start.
There you go. I walked into that one, but I'll take it. We're going to keep each other accountable.
Absolutely. But sincerely, thank you so much for the opportunity. It's been a blast. And if there's ever a day that we can collaborate again, I look forward to it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for listening another episode. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. Now, you can find this podcast on all major platforms as well as the YouTube channel. You know the drill. Like and subscribe or follow depending on the app. And the description of the episode, you will find her links as well as mine. Hope you have a blessed day. Bye-bye.